Welcome to Lecture 7. In this lecture, we are going to discuss utilitarianism. In the next few lectures, I want to discuss the three main ethical theories, one being utilitarianism, the second one, Kantian ethics, and the third one is virtue ethics. So let's talk about utilitarianism. The very word utilitarianism comes from the word utility. But before we talk about utilitarianism proper, let me explain where utilitarianism comes from. Utilitarianism is one of the many theories that belong to the family of consequentialism. Consequentialism is the view that right or wrong depend only on their consequences. That's why it's known as consequentialism. In other words, only consequences matter means that when you are confronted by a moral question of any kind, according to consequentialism, what you have to do in order to know what to do in the circumstance is to think about the consequence. For example, should I throw a bottle out the window? Well, a typical consequentialist, well, let me just say this. Any sensible, normal consequentialist would say that that's wrong no matter what. You just don't do that. But just for the sake of argument, just to explain the principle. Should I throw a glass bottle out the window? Doesn't matter that it's glass. According to consequentialism, the idea would be that we don't know. In order to know whether that act is permissible or not, or take any other act, for example, telling a lie, or standing up your friend, cheating on your test. All these moral questions can be determined. I mean, what I mean by can be determined, I mean the course of action regarding these moral issues can be determined on the basis of their consequences. So what happens if I throw a bottle out the window? What are the consequences? What are the consequences of my cheating on a test? What are my consequences? What are the consequences of my getting an abortion? And once you reflect upon the consequences, you determine what you ought to do. How do you determine that? I'm going to explain it in a minute. But just to give you a quick taste of consequentialism, the idea would be look at the consequences, and if the consequences lead somehow, or probably the better word to use is produce. If the consequences of your actions produce a state of affairs whereby a lot of desirable consequences come about, then you are in the right direction. So what I mean is this. Say, for example, that, again, the hypothetical throwing out the bottle out the window. I throw out the bottle, and I can see that no one is downstairs. No one is going to get hit by my bottle. And the bottle is not going to break, for example. And I happen to know that by throwing that bottle, I somehow do a favor to a person, or something bizarre happens. Something bizarre in the sense that by throwing that bottle out the window, I bring into existence, or I bring about a certain amount of pleasure or happiness. I know I picked the wrong example with the bottle, and I stuck to it, but it doesn't matter. The point is, let's use a better example. Let's use the example of telling a lie. Okay. So what happens if I lie to this person? I can see that by lying to a person, for example, a criminal or a bad guy. There's a bad guy, let's assume, who's after you. And I know for a fact that if he finds you, he will break your legs. Right? So I decide to lie, because I can see that if I lie to him, if I tell him, look, Michael, the guy you're looking for, I saw him 5 minutes ago heading down to Queens. He was on a Q train. But in reality, I know that Michael is heading uptown Manhattan. Now, it's clear, it seems clear to me at least, that if I do that, if I lie to this criminal, what's going to happen? What are the consequences of that? Well, I save the life, or maybe not the life, but at least the legs of Michael. Michael is not going to get beat up by this criminal. And so at the end of the day, according to consequentialism, I have done what is right. That's how they measure what is right. Well, why is that? Because I brought about a state of affairs where I produced more happiness than unhappiness on balance. Namely, Michael is going to be happy when I told him that I sent the criminal to Queens. I'm going to be happy because Michael's my friend. His family is going to be happy. Now, naturally, the criminal is not going to be happy, but the level of unhappiness, it's so small compared to the happiness. And so that's a very rough idea of the way consequentialism approaches morality. Now, why do I talk about consequentialism? Because, as I mentioned earlier, utilitarianism is a moral theory that belongs to the family of consequentialism. It is a consequentialist theory. So many other people would say that this is the wrong way to go. If you lie, you lie. It doesn't matter. Okay? It doesn't matter whether you lie for a good cause or not. You're still lying, and lying is wrong. So it might be in principle wrong, but consequentialists argue, what's the point of saying that something is wrong and something is right if we we don't produce good consequences. What's the point of telling the truth just because we want to follow a principle? Never lie. When by following that very principle, I might cause harm to people, to innocent people. That's the idea of consequentialism. So consequentialism is very different from deontological ethics, which we will be studying next, where deontological ethics argues there are certain rules, we can discover these rules or we can decide these rules, and we have to follow them. Virtue ethics is an entirely different approach to morality. Virtue ethics says, forget about what I ought to do. Before we talk about what we ought to do, let's talk about what is a good person. Because if we produce and we educate good people, people who are virtuous, people who have a good character, who are generous, who are nice, who are kind, who are friendly, then you don't have to worry about doing the right thing, because whatever a good, virtuous individual does is going to be, by default, right. Also, many people embrace what some might call pragmatic ethics. The idea that morality, like science, advances socially, and it is subject to revision. So morality is a social enterprise, so to speak, and we can change it as we go. Now, I have to say that there are many, many different types of utilitarianism and consequentialism. For example, there's actual consequentialism, which says that whether an act is morally right depends only on the actual consequences, not the consequences that I foresee or that I suppose that they might come about. There's a maximizing consequentialism, which says that moral rightness depends only on which consequences are best. Aggregative consequentialism essentially says which consequences are best is some function of the values of parts of the consequences, as opposed to a ranking of whole worlds or states of consequences. Universal consequentialism, well, you get the idea. Moral rightness depends on the consequences for all people or all sentient beings, including animals, or you decide. So there are many, many different types. Ethical hedonism, we just talked about ethical hedonism in a previous lecture. It's the idea that pleasure and suffering are the only components of well-being, and therefore we ought to do what increases the pleasure or happiness of other individuals. Now, of course, if you remember from previous lecture, ethical hedonism can be universalistic or individualistic. But typically, utilitarianism is universalistic. The two founders of utilitarianism are John Stuart Mill and Jeremy Bentham. We already encountered these two fellows in a previous lecture, if you remember. And let me start by giving a definition of utilitarianism, at least the way John Stuart Mill defines it. He argues that utilitarianism is the creed which accepts as the foundation of morals utility. What is utility? It is the greatest happiness principle. And what is this the greatest happiness principle? It is the principle that says that actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness. When are your actions wrong? Well, the opposite side, when they tend to produce the reverse of happiness, misery, pain, suffering, and so on. Now, the utilitarian principle acts to promote the greatest good or the greatest happiness for the greatest number. It's not entirely precise. Most people, most teachers of ethics define the utilitarianism with the motto, the greatest good for the greatest number. But it's more complicated. It's more complicated than that. It's more subtle than that. But let's start with Bentham. Bentham, remember from hedonism, bases utilitarianism, his moral theory, on hedonism, universalistic hedonism. Bentham's utilitarianism is typically referred to as act utilitarianism. Bentham's project, let's try to understand where Bentham was coming from. His project was to find an objective basis for moral decision making. Bentham thought that we have to be precise in ethics. That's the way that's what morality demands of us. We have to be precise. We have to be consistent. And so we have to find not only a way to be objective, but also a way to be consistent. And the only way appears to be to maximize the happiness of all the individuals involved. So he rejected notions of, for example, moral sense. Some people say, what I ought to do is a function or a matter of what I feel. It feels right to me to tell the truth. That's nonsense, according to Bentham. We cannot rely consistently on our moral feelings, because our moral feelings sometimes, or I should say often, are misguided. But also to capture the importance of morality just by a series of rules, of duties, doesn't seem right, because human beings are very complex, and just setting up some rules that you have to follow no matter what just doesn't seem right. So as you remember from the previous lecture, he thought that pleasure is the only objective good and pain the only objective evil. Now, of course, there might be people who enjoy evil, doing evil, but that's because they are deranged, not because they're normal. Any sensible person would think that evil doing is just wrong. And again, any sensible person would say that pleasure and happiness is what it's all about. Any sensible person pursues happiness and avoids pain and suffering and misery. So happiness on this account is defined as the maximization of pleasure and the minimization of pain. That is the only principle, according to utilitarianism, Bentham's utilitarianism, and most utilitarians, by the way. That is the only principle that we should follow in morality, in ethics. The maximization of pleasure and the minimization of pain. Now, the way we do this, and the individuals for whom we are trying to maximize the pleasure, is all a different story. And that will define different kinds of utilitarianism. But let's stick to the most plain and the classical utilitarianism, hedonistic utilitarianism. Remember what Jeremy Bentham, probably you remember this quote: nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure, and it is for them alone to point out what we ought to do. So in a way, what's interesting is that Bentham, as far as I understand, Bentham was not a religious person, but I might be wrong. You can check on that maybe. But the point is the following. According to Bentham, you should not worry about what God says, or what your family says, what your friends say. The only thing that you should worry is that human beings are under the governance of pain and pleasure. And it is also true that we don't like pain, but we do like and we seek pleasure and happiness. So let's not kid each other. Let's be honest. These are the only thing that count. Pleasure and pain. They count in the sense that we want pleasure, we avoid pain. That is the only principle. Now, how does Bentham then propose that we determine what we ought to do? What is his improvement in ethical theory? How do we find out what we ought to do, our duties? Well, according to Bentham, we can use what he calls a hedonistic calculus. The hedonistic calculus works this way. It's really like a mathematical calculus. So first of all, it assumes that pleasures and pains are quantifiable. So for example, I pinch your face and I say, how much pain did you experience from, say, 1 to 10? And you say to me, oh, I experienced 3. Okay. I pinch harder and you say, oh, that was a 5 or a 7. And also, Bentham assumes that you experience pleasure, you can quantify pleasure. So, for example, last summer, you went on vacation. You went to Honolulu on the islands, the Hawaiis. How much pleasure did that give you from 1 to 10? Oh, it was an 8.5, maybe, or 9. So that's the assumption. You can quantify pleasure and pain. Pleasures and pains. Then what? Then also it assumes that pleasures are equal, but not equal in the sense that whether I attain pleasure from going on vacation or playing the PlayStation and scratching my butt on a couch all day. Doesn't matter, because according to Bentham, remember this is very important. According to Bentham, pleasure is pleasure. Okay? So according to, starting from these premises, now what do? We set up a simple calculation that enables us to understand which actions are morally permissible and which actions are not morally permissible. So you see, all this is done independently of God, independently of the rules of your parents, the rules of your country. And it's something, according to Bentham, I guess, something so simple that anybody can do. So we calculate the merits of any action according to the criteria. So the idea is, should I lie to this person? Remember my example earlier. Should I lie to a criminal and tell them that Michael is heading toward Queens when in reality he's going to Manhattan? Well, according to Bentham, the way we find out is by setting up a calculus. This calculus has many criteria. The first criteria is intensity. So I set up the calculus and I determine how much pleasure and how much on the one side, how much pleasure and how much pain on the other side will be brought about as a result of my action, whichever that is, lying, getting an abortion, or whatever, anything. So you assign a number of the intensity of pleasure and the intensity of pain. What about the duration? How long it's going to last? What about the certainty or the uncertainty? How certain are we that by lying to, for example, I lie to the criminal, how certain it is that the criminal will actually hop on the train and go to Queens? What if he smells there's something fishy and he finds out that I'm lying and he kills me? He breaks my legs instead. What about the nearness or remoteness? So how soon or how far, how remote is the pleasure that is supposed to come about? Also the fecundity. Fecundity, it means whether this pleasure or the opposite of pleasure is going to produce more pleasure as a result, or more pain and suffering. Also the purity. Remember earlier I spoke about the fact that you produce a certain amount of happiness by acting in a certain way, but very often your actions, though they produce happiness, they also produce, in concomitance, they produce some pain, some suffering. And so we have to calculate that too. How pure is the pleasure? Then what do? Once we take into consideration all these criteria, we assign a number. Then we multiply 1 through 6 by number of the affected individuals, because we have to take into consideration how many individuals will be affected by my actions. Now, which kind of individuals are we talking about here? Only men? Only women? That depends on the kind of utilitarianism. Now, Jeremy Bentham has an argument for that, how to determine who counts in my calculus. It's a very neat argument. Here it is. He says, when we think about what counts in morality, we said that what counts is pleasure and pain, or to be more precise, the maximization of pleasure and the minimization of pain. Now, a question is the following. Who can experience pleasure and pain? Italians, French people, African people, women, men, babies. But what about dogs? Yes, dogs do. They can feel pain, pleasure. What about zebras? Certainly. What about cows? Certainly, they experience pleasure too. Now, if these are individuals that are capable of experiencing pleasure and pain, which we call with the name of sentient. Sentient is a word for individuals that can feel pleasure or pain. If they can experience, they are capable of experiencing pleasure and pain, they matter and they enter our calculation. So what happens when we do this calculus? Well, obviously, according to Bentham, we have to sum the values on the one side, on the pleasures, and on the other side, on the pains. Now, you see where this is going, right? If you end up with the column of the pleasures, giving you a figure which is much higher than the pains, then you know what to do. You have to do the action that produces, on balance, more pleasure than pain. But remember this is very important. This is very important. We have to determine which action, on the basis of this calculus, which action is morally permissible. But remember that we are not trying just to make a lot of happiness. And if we make a lot of happiness, we're good. We have to take into consideration the level of unhappiness. So if I act in a certain way, let's say I have two options. I can act in the way that we call X, and I can act in the way that we call Y. Now, pay attention. If I act in the way X, I produce an enormous amount of pleasure for a great number of individuals. However, at the same time, I also bring about quite a considerable amount of pain or misery. Okay, but still, the level of happiness, of pleasure, on balance, is much greater than the opposite. However, consider that we have option Y. Okay, this was our option X. Now, option Y, we look at option Y, and the amount of pleasure is very low, very low, compared to X. However, on balance, the level of pain and misery brought about is very minimal. When you look at X and Y, which act are you going to pursue? Well, according to utilitarianism, you have to choose the one that on balance brings about more happiness than more pleasure than pain or suffering. So it doesn't matter that X brings about more pleasure. The important thing is on balance, which act is capable of bringing about the best possible blend of pleasure and and pain, where pleasure is considerably more than pain and suffering. I hope it's clear you get the point. So the act must be the greatest good for the greatest number, yes, but it has to be measured on the basis of which act is the more pure one, so to speak. So the quantity of pleasures being equal, pushpin is as good as poetry. So according to Bentham, as I said earlier, Bentham doesn't make a distinction between pleasure and pleasure. All pleasure is good, whether it comes from pushpin, which was a game, or doing poetry. But as we know, we discussed earlier in the previous lecture, pleasures are not all equal. Furthermore, another problem is happiness really quantifiable? I'm not sure if we can do that. Also, another problem that many people point out with utilitarianism is that it seems that there is too much to ask each individual to calculate each act, especially considering the fact that we don't have time to do that. But Bentham and Mill also have a reply to that. They say, well, look, if you are a Christian, for example, and you follow Christian morality, do you have the time to consult the Bible? You see, you can't do that. So what do is you have internalized moral principles according to Christianity, and you follow those principles. So the calculation that you do is just normal. And after all, don't we calculate normally every single day? You calculate whether you're going to be late for work. We calculate whether you should talk to that girl or not. You calculate which car you should buy, and so on. We do a bunch of calculations on a daily basis. So why should it be a problem when it comes to morality? Also, what is the ideal reach of the theory? What does it require exactly? The greatest good for the greatest number. But what number? How many individuals? How many animals? Only local? Only in my country? Only the individual here and now? The future individual? So it gets complicated, of course. But this is not to say that this is a knockdown argument against utilitarianism, because utilitarians are very clever and they have discussed all these issues over the years. Also, some might point out that its premise, that of psychological hedonism, undermines the very ethical principle of utilitarianism, because if you remember, I talked about this a number of times. It is always a bad idea to determine morality from a description of the world, and that's exactly what the utilitarians seem to do. They start with from the premise that human beings naturally pursue pleasure and avoid pain, and consequently it moves to the conclusion that we ought to do exactly that. John Stuart Mill is going to propose a different kind of utilitarianism, which typically is known as rule utilitarianism. Mill, I guess, didn't like the fact that we have to decide on the occasion. He pointed out that we have experience in morality. We acquire experience over time, and we can kind of know what to do. For example, if you remember my extravagant example earlier of throwing a bottle out the window, well, Mill would say we don't need to calculate that. We know that it's just a bad idea to do that, even if we don't hurt anybody by doing that. Now, what if for some very bizarre accident, my throwing the bottle out the window for some crazy reason brings about an enormous amount of happiness for a large number of people, well, then that's a different story. Then Mill would say, then by all means, that's what we have to do. We have to do it. So in trying to correct a lot of the problems, the issues in Bentham's version of utilitarianism, Mill proposes a rule utilitarianism where we use it. Now, I know what you're thinking. You said, but wait a minute, Professor. You just said at the outset of this lecture that according to Bentham, we don't follow rules. Isn't that the whole point of utilitarianism? Yes, it is. But these rules that I'm talking about are not categorical rules. They are utilitarian rules. What are utilitarian rules? Well, they are rules that, such as never lie unless, there's always an unless. So these rules are not fixed. They're not universal. They are utilitarian rules, rules that we believe they are conducive to the greatest good for the greatest number. Now, if they, in fact, we can see it clearly that they are not going to be conducive to the greatest good for the greatest number, then we can always jettison these rules and use other rules, other principles. So there's no time previous to action for calculating and weighing the effects on any line of conduct on general happiness. Well, we talked about this before, this objection. Yes, I guess this slide says exactly what I explained a second ago. Now, the main improvement was that Bentham, remember, thought that pleasure is pleasure. Doing poetry or sitting on a couch all day gives you, if they give you pleasure, it doesn't matter how you get the pleasure, as long as it's pleasure. Now you can see where this is going. If pleasure is pleasure, then you can do anything atrocious, horrible, as long as it gives you pleasure. This is a very telling and damaging criticism to the theory. So according to Mill, not all pleasure is pleasure. All pleasures are not equal. There are pleasures that are worth more. And we talked about this. The intellectual pleasures are more important than the hedonistic, the physical pleasures. So doing philosophy is more important, or I should say the pleasure that you attain from doing philosophy is more important than the pleasure you attain from playing video games all day. So he distinguished base from noble pleasure. Now, another very important and very recent form of utilitarianism is what is known as preference utilitarianism, also known as preferentialism, if you like that word. And according to preferentialism, we, instead of calculating the amount of pleasure and pain, like in the case of Mill and Bentham, you see, Mill corrected some errors. He just said there are pleasures that produce more, they are more important, and so the happiness that you attain from, as I said, from doing philosophy or writing poetry is more valuable than the pleasure you gain from eating Doritos all day and playing video games. Okay, so more recent philosophers said that this is just unintelligible. How do we make sense of pleasure in the first place? It's not quantifiable. So rather than talking about pleasure, let's talk about preferences. That is more manageable, isn't it? I don't know. So the idea is, instead of maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain, why don't we try to maximize preferences? Now, of course, there are preferences and preferences, but it's easier to manage, to understand preference than to understand happiness, because happiness is this very vague concept. But what about preferences? I prefer to eat Doritos all day, or white people prefer to enslave brown people, or men prefer to subjugate women. Well, according to preference utilitarianism, we can avoid these issues by thinking about what the preferences, true preferences of a rational individual. Who's rational? I don't know, but we have a rough idea. Okay, if you were a perfectly rational individual, would you want to subjugate women? Probably not, because you would frustrate the preferences of women. Okay, so that's the point. Yes, we have to maximize preferences, but we have to take into account all individuals' preferences, all those individuals who have preferences. So what about men? They do have preferences. What about brown people? They do have preferences. What about white people? They do have preferences. What about chickens? They do have preferences. What about cows? They do have preferences. So their preferences have to be taken into account. Now, obviously, a preference utilitarian would say to you that the preferences of human beings are typically, but not always, more important than the preferences of animals. Now, why do you say that? Well, think about this. Are more important the preferences of slave owners, or the preferences of Hitler or Stalin, or the preferences of a cow? I don't know you, but I would say that the preferences of a cow are more important. So there are several advantages of utilitarianism. An obvious one is the ideal observer. According to consequentialism, we can use the idea of a neutral observer, a perfectly rational individual. Problem is, in practice, it is difficult because to take the point of view of an ideal observer means that we have to take the view of an individual, an observer, who knows a great deal of things, who knows everything, who is omniscient. But such an individual is hard to come by. So it's a kind of a problem. Not to mention the fact that, what do we mean by perfectly rational? Another advantage of utilitarianism is that it is egalitarian, because a utilitarian thinks about morality in an egalitarian terms, in the sense that I don't care what you look like. I don't care whether you're short, tall, blonde, brown, curly hair, glasses, fat, skinny. All I care about is the maximization of preferences or utility, pleasure, pain. And I don't care whether you are ugly or handsome. All I care is the preferences. So by doing that, as you can see, you avoid a lot of discrimination, a lot of racism, because you don't look at people in the eyes and in the face. You merely determine the amount of pleasure for the greatest number of individuals. Not only brown individuals or green individuals or white individuals, but all individuals. Now, actions should promote positive consequences, according to virtually all utilitarian philosophers. As much happiness as possible to the greatest possible number of beings, and we should avoid pain and suffering and misery. Also, it helps somehow make tough decisions. Morality is tough. Making moral decisions is tough. But if we follow a principle, if we follow this idea of the neutral observer, if we do a calculus, obviously we are facilitated in determining what is the right course of action. What about critique of utilitarianism? Well, there are many, many different critiques of utilitarianism, and I'm not going to go over all of them because I want you to think about it and actually talk about it in our forum discussions, okay? But the one that I wanted to mention is, since I assigned Bernard Williams, Bernard Williams argues that consequentialism essentially is, and this is the most interesting and the most telling criticism of utilitarianism, and that is, it's a moral theory that if you follow, you will be alienated by it. Why? Because it requires moral agents, moral people like us, to do a calculus, and as a result of the calculus, I have to act. So if you think about it, this means that according to utilitarianism, now, as I said many times, the story, it's more complicated than that, but roughly according to utilitarianism, I should not worry about my personal feelings. So for example, if I have to lie to a person because lying is the only action that will lead to the greatest good for the greatest number, utilitarianism says you ought to lie in this particular circumstance. But what if I feel uneasy? What if I feel bad about lying? Well, according to utilitarianism, I should not be squeamish about it, and I ought to do my duty and do what the calculus tells me to do. This is a big problem, according to Bernard Williams, because that's not the way we do morality, and it's not a good way of doing morality, because we leave out a lot of important things like relationship, like specific details of a moral circumstance. We leave out our moral feelings. We leave out justice. We leave out many important things, many important ingredients of morality. Okay, so as I said, I expect you to come up with criticisms, problems, issues of utilitarianism. Some of them are on my PowerPoint presentation, but I encourage you to come up with, to think about it and come up in the discussions rather than looking at the PowerPoint. But anyway, this is the end of this lecture. Once again, as usual, I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time.